I'm Harry Spillane. I'm a historian of early modern Britain and Europe. But today we're talking about something different. We're talking about the period before, during, and around World War One. And so we're joined today by Dr. Saul Yardley, who can introduce himself better than I.
Hello, everybody. Nice to be here, and thank you, Harry. Yes, so we're talking about the First World War. I'm really an expert on military history, starting from around the end of the 17th century into probably about the Second World War. So which includes the First World War, which is what we'll be talking about in a little bit.
Great. And it strikes me that, particularly in the British education system, the First World War gets a bit of a rough time, really, doesn't it? It sort of gets boxed out by other things. And so we've got our first question around Europe prior to the First World War. And I suppose I had in mind that kind of long 19th century idea of 1789 up to 1914, which is very much overlooked, I think, in the British education system, isn't it? So perhaps you'd tell us something about that.
Yes, no, it reminds me, and I might have told this story before, but I remember being a little boy in primary school and being told by our history teacher, who was sort of running this history club, that there were these periods that had arbitrarily just been avoided by the educational system, and there are periods that haven't. And really, I think a lot of it is just that there is so much history out there that you can't really cover everything. And there's a debate about, should you go into a subject in detail, or should you try and cover several more in less detail? Maybe it's something that we can talk about another time, Harry. But yeah, just to sort of draw a picture of the turn of the 20th century. And I think it's fair to say that Europe is the center of the world in a way that it isn't anymore. And the European empires are in some ways at the height of their power. They control all of Africa. They have significant assets in the Middle East, in Asia. The financial systems in South America are almost entirely dependent on European trade. And this creates a concentration of power. And the Europeans are at such an extent of power that they can have conferences together, like in Berlin, where they decide where boundaries across the world are going to be between their own colonial powers. And Europe itself is also very aristocratic, I would say, in that Britain and Germany and Russia are run by a very small group of people. There is democracy to various extents, but power is still concentrated in the hands of several people. And as well as that, the countries have gone through quite a significant amount of social change, of economic change. The Industrial Revolution has changed Europe in the beginning of the 19th century, and then we have what we call the Second Industrial Revolution, part of which is concentrated in Germany, which again makes these countries more wealthy, but also there is bigger differences between different groups of people, between working class people, between wealthier people. So as well as being a Europe where the aristocrats still maintain quite a lot of control, it's also a Europe of tension, it's a Europe of change, and it's a Europe which is also becoming increasingly inflexible in its attempts to redistribute power. And you mentioned the long 19th century. One of the things that historians often think about with that is, why is it that we have this really, really big war with Napoleon at the beginning of the 19th century, and then that is followed on from quite a lot of regular big wars throughout the 18th century. Every 15, 20 years, there's another major war. But yet we have this gap from 1815, when Napoleon is defeated, to 1914. And even though we have a couple of smaller wars, in 1866, Prussia and Austria go to war, in 1870, Prussia and France go to war, these don't become general European conflicts. So it's a Europe that changing in tension, but also in some ways it feels like it's overdue a war in some way, and that war has been very regular. But then there's this space, and then these tensions are growing, and there's inflexibility in the alliance structures seem to be becoming solidified in a way that is becoming worrisome and in some ways more likely for war to break out.
Mm-hmm. So that nicely sets the scene then for some of the kind of longer term structural causes, the social, technological changes. In terms of the short term causes, or the kind of catalyst flashpoint moments that caused the war, which would you single out for us?
I think this is a sort of a difficult question to answer, because it's really one that does have a lot of writing about it. And you have, and the general understanding of the First World War is that it is a war that people don't want, that it's generally, there's this scene, there's a historian called J.C.D. Raw, which has a really good account of the couple of days before the war. And there's a moment when the Kaiser of Germany realizes that the war is about to break out. And he's desperately trying to get in contact with British ministers to say, hey, we don't want this to happen. Please, can we figure this out? And his advisors say to him, it's just too late. There's nothing that we can really do about it. But so the more immediate causes, firstly, there's a big rise in the power of Germany, particularly over the Navy. And this has been one of the things that the British and the French as well have been worried about when Germany was reunified. Both of them, particularly the French, had been colluding in keeping Germany decentralized, keeping it weak, keeping a lot of separate powers which could sort of outfight each other and then prevent them from unifying. And the German Kaiser is very excited about having colonial possessions. He's excited about increasing the size of the Navy. And there's tensions there with the British because they see themselves as being the main naval and imperial power. There are crises in Morocco, partly related to this in 1905 and also in 1911. The Kaiser is also very good at insulting the British. At one point, he avoids meeting his own uncle, who is at the time the heir to the British throne, just towards the turn of the 20th century. And yeah, I mean, there's this, and I think it sort of comes back to this lack of flexibility as well, that Bismarck, who had been the leader of Germany, had created a Germany that was not very good at being flexible. I think that states are created in light of the circumstances of their creation. And what Bismarck had done is he created this compromise system where there was power to the old kings of the independent areas of Germany before they were united. And then there were different levels of sort of parliament equivalents. And none of these were particularly wieldy. And then the minister president, which was his role that he'd held until he was replaced in 1890, was also a bit of a hodgepodge of responsibilities, that really the main responsibility was to pass the Kaiser's bills through Parliament, but didn't actually sit themselves in Parliament in a way that the British Prime Minister does sit in Parliament. So, and then what happened was, I think that as the years went on, Germany's ability to negotiate peace or to have diplomatic solutions to problems began eroding. And you see things like the military attachés, which were sent to foreign governments to collaborate on military matters, often had more authority or more say in what was going on than the ambassadors, which were representing the German diplomatic service. So military solutions were becoming more and more of an appealing way of resolving problems with other countries with predictably disastrous results. But picking out one of them to really say, well, this is what the problem is very difficult. The Treaty of Versailles that ends the war says the Germans are the ones that are to blame for it and they should pay reparations and accept the guilt of that. I don't think many historians would say today that that is really a simple way or an appropriate way of understanding why the war broke out, but it is one way of looking at it. So yes, I'm avoiding being pinned down on one of them, but there's definitely different ways of looking at it. Yeah.
And with that kind of escalation then, so I suppose what you were suggesting there is that it's not so much a want for war, but an inability to maintain peace. Is that how we should think about it?
Yes, exactly. I think, circumstances are also very important. I think that people are able to shape what happens. But I think that the structural nature of what was going on in the years leading up to 1914 meant that war was more likely to break out than if some of those structural issues hadn't have been there. And then there are the immediate causes, which we can talk about as well, the assassination of Franz Ferdinand, and then there are complications over sort of railway timetables in Russia as well, which means that the Russians have to choose whether they're going to go for a partial mobilization or a complete mobilization when the Austrians start to threaten the Serbians after Franz Ferdinand is assassinated, because he's assassinated by Gavrilo Princip, who is a Serbian. So the Austrians then threaten to invade Serbia. The Russians say, we're going to protect the Serbs. and they've then got a choice to go for partial mobilization or complete mobilization. And they're worried that if they only go for partial mobilization, the railway timetables are complicated in such a way that it'd be very difficult for them to then reverse their decision and go back for full mobilization. So they go for full mobilization. The Germans say, well, why have you gone for full mobilization? It's clearly because you're expecting to fight a general European war, which would include us. So then they mobilize their troops, and then that sort of just leads to this spiral effect. So there are certainly these kind of structural issues which make the war more likely to happen. There is a sort of an element of decision. I think I do think that by June of 1914, July of 1914, it's sort of becoming inevitable. But whether at the beginning of 1914 it was, I certainly don't think so. I think that they, we wouldn't even think about it if there hadn't been a war. We're very good at looking back in history and saying, well, this happened. Why did this happen? But there are counterfactuals which could have happened, but because they didn't, we just kind of think, well, it didn't happen. So we can't.
And I suppose that raises questions about when the war starts. I mean, I suppose that the date most people would be able to give you, if you polled them out on the streets for the First World War, is the end, isn't it? Is Armistice Day. So, but in terms of the start, how would you describe for us the start point and those kind of opening moves of the war?
Yeah, so the war starts with this sort of mobilization of the various armies in Europe. And then the main sort of defining part of the beginning of the war, I would suggest, is the Schlieffen Plan, which is this German realization that if they're fighting a two-front war, which they've realized that they're going to be fighting because they know that the Russians and the French have been collaborating with each other. The problem is with doing that is that you're going to be invaded from the east and invaded in the west. And how do you fight a two-front war? Because it's not easy to shuttle troops between the two armies if you've got to go right across the breadth of Germany. So the Schlieffen Plan is this idea that the German army will march into France in a very quick lightning campaign, similar to what they'd done in 1870, defeat the French, and then spin around with the expectation that because Russia is so big, it's not going to be able to mobilize its forces anywhere near as quickly as the French will, and therefore they'll be able to come back in time to fight off the Russian invasion of Germany that they're expecting, and then to defeat the Russian army itself. And that's really what they try. So they cross into Belgium, which is what brings the British into the war. They begin advancing towards Paris, again with this expectation that if they can capture Paris, then the French will sue for peace. But for a variety of reasons, it's unsuccessful. Firstly, the Russians invade Germany a lot quicker than the Germans expected them to have invaded. The Russians are defeated by Hindenburg and Ludendorff, who are going to go on to be the main dominating figures of the German war effort, particularly towards the latter parts of the war. So troops from the Western Front have to be sent off to the Eastern Front. Then the British also arrive faster than they're expected. And the British would say, the French would probably disagree, that the British army holds itself very well in its initial fights with the German army. And the Germans are then held off at the Marne. The Belgians also show up themselves to be very competent soldiers, and the Germans take longer to get through Belgium than they initially thought that they would. And being held up at the Marne means that the Germans are not able to knock out France, and they then get stuck fighting in what is in eastern France without being able to break through. And the Allies, for the first couple of years, are not able to push them very significantly far back in France either. So yes, those are sort of the opening moves, the first couple of months of the war.
Right. And there you started to talk about being held up, which brings us on to this question of trench warfare, which is perhaps one of the defining images people will have of the First World War. So, I mean, what is it? How does it start, and why does it persist?
Yeah. So the beginning of the war is dynamic. It's a war of movement. So armies are marching, they're fighting, they're going to different places. Trench warfare also doesn't really exist on the Eastern Front. It's really a Western Front phenomenon. And I think, maybe I'm going back to these bigger structural issues, I think that it comes down to the dominance of the time of attack over defense. So firepower has advanced massively. People didn't expect to be facing artillery power of the strength that it was. And it meant that at the beginning of the war, the majority of casualties are being inflicted by artillery shells rather than by any other form of infantry killing each other or whatever else that people do when they're doing nasty things to each other during war times. And the trench warfare is really just a way initially to get yourself out of the way of artillery shells. So the troops just dig downwards to then hide under the ground so that they are much more protected from these huge exploding shells. And then what happens is this sort of more immediate problem, this immediate solution, I should say, to the artillery shells, then begins to create these more structured battlefields. And then after the Marne and the Germans pull back a little bit, there's this what's called the race to the sea, where each side tries to outflank each other, but then what ends up happening is they keep outflanking, building these trench lines that they're trying to also get around, and it takes them all the way to the English Channel. And you end up with this line of trenches, which pretty much runs continuously from the English Channel all the way to the Swiss mountains. And these trenches are initially just sort of holes in the ground, but then by a couple of years into the war, they're being built with all of this barbed wire, which is one of those sort of iconic images of the war. They've also got concrete. They're very serious. You've got these supporting trenches. In some places, you might have 3 or 4 lines of trenches, which are sort of interconnected with each other. And this creates this new type of warfare where the soldiers are in these trenches. But again, initially, it's really to protect them from artillery shells, but then it becomes sort of the mode of combat until 1917, beginning of 1918, when the war starts becoming dynamic again for various reasons, partly technological advance, but then also there's new American troops arriving, and the shape of the war begins to shift towards the end of 1917.
And I suppose in terms of trench warfare, the kind of value of it, seems again something that people walk into rather accidentally. There's not at first then this plan to draw up this network of trenches. Is that part of the reason why there's such a messy mishmash of structures?
Yes, yeah. I mean, there are equivalents that one can actually see in the American Civil War. So the whole concept is not completely novel, but it is a sort of the instrumentation of this. It's sort of how defined it becomes in the war, and I think it does. It's almost coincidental in that people don't think, oh, it's time to fight trench warfare. Let's give up on having these dynamic armies and cavalry charges, which was also something that they thought was going to happen in the war, but ended pretty quickly. And then there was just, because there's another way of thinking about it as well, is it gives armies protection while you can figure out what's going on. So you have these industrialized weapons, you have armies of millions of soldiers, which has just never been seen. In the biggest battle that was fought in the Napoleonic time, the Battle of Leipzig, is somewhere in around 500,000 soldiers, which is a lot of people to be fighting at any one time. But in the First World War, I mean, that's 10% of some of these armies. I mean, the armies are just huge. There are millions, literally millions of people fighting in this conflict. And partly it's just to give soldiers a breathing space and officers a breathing space to think, what do we do? How do we fight this new type of industrialized warfare? We've not fought a general European conflict in 100 years.
Mm.
But yes,
that perhaps brings us to the point about officers and strategy. And I think depending perhaps on which generation you're from, you have a different popular image of the First World War, be it kind of, War Horse or Blackadder. And I think for me, the kind of General Melchett way of thinking about the British war effort is there. And that image then of the lions led by donkeys. Perhaps you'd say more about that and whether you think that's a fair representation of the war effort.
Yeah. I mean, I have to say firstly that I love Blackadder. So it's, even if I don't think that lions led by donkeys is a good way of justifying what happens in the war, that doesn't stop me from watching Blackadder. But it's also, I wonder, maybe you're similar with this, Harry, but sometimes as a historian, you watch something with historical content and it's slightly wrong and you like to shout at the television a little bit, but you still watch it and just,
Yeah.
get told off by a partner or something that, can you please shut up so I can
Yes.
get on and
Yeah,
watch.
definitely.
Yeah. So this idea of lions led by donkeys is popularized after the First World War, shortly after the First World War, by David Lloyd George. And the main reason why Lloyd George does that is because there is this backlash after the war that the soldiers come back. There's horrific shell shock and injuries, and there is effectively a generation of young men is either dead, horrifically injured, or suffering from severe psychological disorders from having to fight in the trenches. One of the things, sort of just to add on with trench warfare as well, is that what's sort of novel about the way the First World War is fought is that in previous wars, soldiers generally were safe 90% of the time, but then that 10% of the time they were really at risk of being seriously hurt or killed. So if you were a Napoleonic army, most of the time you'd just be wandering around following your general, and then you'd have the day of battle where you might get killed, and there was a sort of a fairly decent chance that was happening. But human beings are able to psychologically understand that because that was how we evolved to be. You can be fine most of the time, really, really stressed for a short amount of time, and then go back to being fine again. What happened in the First World War is because soldiers were deployed into the trenches, you'd have several weeks where you were at general risk of being killed at any one time. And that level of stress was really bad for people. And so after the war, when all these people come back, there's then this debate in British society. How did this happen? How have so many people been killed? What should we do about it? And Lloyd George publishes his memoirs about the war. And he basically says, if you want to know why this all went wrong, it's the general's fault. They sat in their nice houses 10 miles away from the front and sent all these young men into the trenches and sent them over the top and sent them to die. And then this gives birth to the lions led by donkeys idea. Personally, I think it's complete nonsense. We know of several senior officers who were killed in the course of the war. Haig, who is somebody who is blamed as being this prime example of a lion who of a donkey who's sending these lions in to die. He is at the front quite a lot, visiting the soldiers, spending time with them, understanding what is going on. After the war ends, he creates this charity which is trying to help them, the veterans, reintegrate into society and find jobs, and the ones who are injured are able to get money to keep surviving. And when you look at the percentages of casualties as well, there's something like 12% of enlisted soldiers are killed during the war, and around 17% of officers are killed during the war. So it's actually a disproportionate number of officers are killed. And when you start looking at even the upper classes, 24 peers or sons of peers who are up to inherit the title, who are in Parliament. So this is people right at the top of society. They're either lords or they're sons of lords, and they're MPs, are killed in the war, which is something like 20% of those who serve. And there's something like 500 casualties, a little more probably, amongst aristocrats, sons of aristocrats. So we're talking right the creme de la creme of British upper class society are killed in the war. There's individual examples like the Earl of Longford, who is actually sort of related to the Duke of Wellington. It's a great aunt. So it's these military families that have been serving for generations. His great uncle was one of Wellington's lieutenants and served throughout the Peninsular War and was killed fighting in America. So really, these military families with titles. He is killed leading the last ever British cavalry charge. He has this sort of defining moment where he tells his officers, don't duck. It's bad for the men's morale if you duck. And then his body's never recovered from the battlefield. So these people give their lives, and there is, I suppose, the idea that maybe you could say that the generals themselves are not always fighting on the front lines, but often that's because they're 60 years old and you can't fight on the front line if you've got 100,000 soldiers under your command. You've got to pick somewhere to command them. So I would say it's not an accurate description of the war at all. It creates a nice narrative, and there's obviously one should have a lot of respect for people at all ranks, including the enlisted men, who have less of a choice about whether they're there or not. They are there because they're conscripted, at least in the latter part of the war. At the beginning, there are volunteers, but there are actually a disproportionate number of the donkeys, so to speak, who are killed fighting in the war.
So, those great names, Haig or Kitchener. I mean,
Yeah,
it's part of the problem that they have come from distinguished military careers and military families, but therefore their understanding of war is kind of passed by. They're dealing with something so very different than what they have, been schooled in and read about, and that their
yeah,
fathers and uncles fought.
yeah. Well, Kitchener, and I'm betraying my own biases here. I think Kitchener was a pretty ineffective commander. He's a very good person due to his intense popularity with parts of the public to help galvanize the British war effort. And when he dies in a ship. He's traveling in the North Sea, and the ship hits a mine, and he's killed. There is this outpouring of grief, and there are reports of soldiers on the front line saying, we've lost our main leader and our motivating factor in Kitchener. So he's very popular, but I would say his military record in India and in Sudan is, in my opinion, leaves a little bit to be desired. But yeah, Haig generally is quite popular with the men, and he is blamed for the Battle of the Somme, which does cause these huge casualties. Whether it's his fault or not that the Somme leads to so many casualties and doesn't really achieve its main objectives is up for debate, because part of the problems with the Somme is that, firstly, the French promised to send dozens of divisions, and then on the eve of the Somme, there's around 5 of them which have actually shown up to the fight. So the British have got to take a bigger role in the battle than they initially thought they would. The second part of the problem with the Somme is that the idea was to relieve the French who were fighting the Germans at Verdun, and if the British launched this assault at the Somme, then the French will then have some relief, as German soldiers have to be deployed from this battlefield of Verdun, where they're taking huge casualties, and the Germans will then go to the Somme. So there's not time. The British commanders have got to launch an assault as quickly as possible to relieve that tension. And then there are issues like the shells. Many of them don't actually blow up. So the initial plan of the Somme was to have this huge barrage of shells, which would then destroy a lot of the barbed wire, damage the trenches, keep the Germans under their own trench lines until as late as possible, when the British army would actually get into the German trenches. But many of the shells don't explode, so then there's not the same destruction. And then there are also the German trenches are a lot stronger than they initially think that they're going to be. But I mean, it's a horrific day. There's, the Manchester Pals Battalion takes something like 70 or 80% casualties in the first day. I mean, you're just talking horrific amounts of death. And yes, and the generals are to blame somewhat, but it's also a different type of war. It's a war that is hard to understand. That there's issues at the beginning as well with command and control. How do you communicate with this number of soldiers? In previous conflicts, you've been able to send letters to people, so there are advances in radio technology, but they even do things like they get little triangles of silver-plated mirrors, effectively, and they put them on the soldiers' backpacks, and then that's a way that the generals can see where the soldiers are because it reflects the light. But that's a very primitive way of communicating. They're also communicating with carrier pigeons as well. So it's sort of old-fashioned, even in those days, ways of communicating. So yes, I'm not really sure whether I answered the question there, but
Yeah, no. I mean, there's just so much to unpack. But you've given us a sense there already of some of the legacies of war around, shell shock and huge casualties. But perhaps we could talk more about how the war, both during and after, shapes British society.
Yeah, so I think it shapes British society profoundly. The immediate thing that it does is that, you have a generation of young men, some of whom were expected to, become political leaders, military leaders, and they're killed as a sort of various, there are like like public schools, which publish lists of the number of soldiers that have died, and Cambridge colleges. You can see there's one in Pembroke that's placed quite prominently when you go in, you see it there. And some of these are people that were expected to go on to lead the country who are no longer alive. But then also just on a more general level amongst the average people, you have just so many families which have lost people, and you have villages where almost all the young men are not coming back from the war, which has this deep effect on society, just partly from a demographic way of looking at it. But then you have other things as well. So women in many cases go into the workforce, they're helping out. And before the war, there'd been pressure for votes to be given to women through the women's suffrage movement. But then that is quietened down during the war as the women help out with the war effort. But then after the war has ended, there's not really an argument anymore to say women shouldn't be given the vote, because they've contributed so much in the factories and the fields to helping Britain with the war effort. And so that changes social relations, social dynamics in the country. And there's also somewhat of a leveling of society. There's a lot of taxation is increased during the war. The aristocrats are taxed very significantly. Death duties are increased. There's also in some cases, aristocrats have either by their own decision or by social pressure have kept rents arbitrarily low in many cases, and then the government comes in and puts taxes on them at the value of their properties rather than where they've set rents. So you end up with the aristocrats, many of them go bankrupt, or they sell large amounts of land, which then increases land ownership rates amongst the middle classes, which again has an impact on the social dynamics of society. But you'll see a similar process that happens after the Second World War, after this very intense conflagration, which is having all these impacts. You then see this readjustment of society, this realignment in terms of where the social emphasis and also the economic levels are. Because some people also make a lot of money off the war, but many more people become impoverished because of the war.
Mm. And one way in which money can be made is industry, isn't it?
Yeah.
So we often talk about industrial war, but what do we actually mean by that?
Yeah, so one idea of this is that the way that society and intellectual thought within society have been developing at the end of the 19th century is this idea that you could stratify society and you could apply statistics to society in a way that hadn't really been done before. And you end up thinking about, a person is just 1/8 of horsepower. And then you sort of build up from there and create all these sort of, amounts of money that people need and amounts of contributions that different people make. And this idea kind of spreads into war, and you end up with this industrial way of looking at how the war is being fought. So you look at how many guns is a country producing, how many uniforms, how many medical kits, and you can sort of list out all of these things. And then also the way that people then assume the war is going to be won is through out producing and out industrying, to create a new word there, and you can use that to look at who's going to win the war. So if you build more factories and you're outproducing your opponents, then you're going to win the war. And it's a way of thinking about the war that previous wars are not thought about in the same way. But then also that armies have become so much more complicated, so they need a lot more equipment to fight wars. So the government has to become more involved in the industrial production to make sure that the armies are supplied with what they need to be able to bring the conflict to the enemy and defeat them.
Mm. I mean, I was thinking back to that kind of lions led by donkeys thing. Is the industrial war part of a way in which soldiers become a bit dehumanized, spoken about more as, statistics and firepower rather than as, battalions of men who, have homes and families and whatever?
Yes, yeah, and I think it's just a case of the scale of the conflict. It's hard to have sympathy. And it's like the quote by Stalin, one death is a tragedy and a million is a statistic. It's very difficult to feel sympathy for vast numbers of people, but you will feel sympathy for the story of one person, that something really bad has happened to them. Yeah, but I think it's as well just countries have become so populous and industries become so important that in some ways it's just seen as this clash of industrial energy and industrial power between two different countries or all the different countries of the First World War. And that's a way to understand how the war is being fought. And you even see it that there are data books that have been published over the last 20 years, and data books of the First World War, data books of the Second World War, in a way that you don't really see them about previous conflicts, where you'll see a data book which will say, this is the number of artillery shells that the British produced in the war, and this is the number of planes that the Germans produced during the war. And it's sort of this industrial catalogue of entities that were produced in order to try and win the war.
Hmm. So we've got sort of industrial war as one label, and then this other label of total war, and the question of whether the First World War constitutes total war, the first total war.
Yeah, so this comes from in the First World War sense, a comment from Clausewitz, who is this Prussian theorist of war at the beginning of the 19th century, who serves in the Napoleonic War and then writes this book called On War, which is this compendium of how war should be fought and understanding a theoretical approach to war. And maybe probably the most famous thing he says in On War is that war is politics by other means. If you want to understand why war happens, why it's fought the way it is, look at the political setting that has caused the war to happen and then shapes the war as it goes along. But one of the things he talks about On War is this idea of total war. And what he means by total war, he says, imagine a perfect total war. And the perfect total war is when you take all the might of one nation, concentrate it into one dot, take all the might of the other nation, concentrate that into one dot, smack them against each other, and see what happens. And in this case, he says, you have no, what he calls friction. And friction is all the things that cause problems to happen during war. So that's a tank breaking down, or food spoiling when it's supposed to arrive, or one of the junior officers turns left at the road rather than turns right at the road. Any sort of little element which was unpredicted, which stops the war achieving this point of totality. So you can't concentrate all of the strength of the war in one point because things just go wrong. And that's always what happens. So Clausewitz has this idea of total war which can never be realized. But then in the First World War, you see this almost drive towards total war, towards this trying to concentrate all the power of the state into that dot. And Ludendorff, who is under Hindenburg at the Battle of the Tannenberg, he takes quite a big role in Germany towards the latter part of the war. And what he tries to do is shape as much of German society and as much of the German economy as possible to gear it towards total war, so it can concentrate all of the power of Germany into this sort of Clausewitzian point, which can then smack against the British efforts. And because it's not concentrated in the same way, it will then win the war for Germany. So total war has this theoretical basis of this Clausewitzian idea of concentrating the power of society towards being able to fight the war. But then it also just really means taking everything within the country, taking all of the people, all of the factories, and making them be as much part of the war effort as possible. And that's sort of what the Germans move towards the latter part of the war. But there's other things that the British are doing as well. I mean, they are taking over factories. They have introduced conscription as well. So really, yeah, there's a theory side, but there's also that more practical side, which is just get as much into the war effort as you possibly can. That's,
And that feeds in. We've thought about industry, but maybe more particularly, we might think about technology and which new technologies you think are impacting and shaping the war.
Yeah, so there's the big obvious ones. The big obvious ones are the tank and the aeroplane. That neither of them have really been used in conflict before, but during the First World War, they are used. They sort of go from not being very useful, but to becoming more useful as the war goes on. The initial use of the tank has mixed results. The Germans are very scared when they first see the tank. They don't really know what's going on, but most of the tanks that were supposed to be used towards the end of 1917. Every time they are deployed, more of them break down than actually get to the front lines to fight, because they just don't really know what they're doing. And some of the armor isn't very good. Sometimes the armor is really good on the front, but it's not very good on the sides. So all the Germans have to do is walk around the side, and they can then kill the operators. But by the end of the war, they are making advancements pretty quickly in tank technology, and then tanks will obviously then go on to play a really big role in the Second World War with Blitzkrieg and the fights that go on there. The aeroplane, I find the aeroplane absolutely fascinating as well, because it's really been only 10-ish, just over 10 years between the first flight, which, we were talking about the Wright brothers making the first flight. It doesn't last very long. It's not this sort of 2-hour flight. It's sort of in the air for less than a minute. But, it starts the ball rolling. And yet by sort of 13 years later, you have planes being used. Initially, they're just used as observation posts that people will fly around and then have a look. And then they start bringing cameras onto the planes. And then they start bringing pistols on the planes to shoot other aircraft which are around. And then they begin mounting guns on the planes. And then they start advancing aircraft technology. So it does have an impact on the war. It helps a lot. I would say reconnaissance is probably the main use. You have sort of an equivalent of the Blitz in Britain, that Germans send over these big Zeppelin blimps and drop a few bombs on London, which is also a new thing. It starts to degrade what had historically existed, which was a division between civilians and the military. Ties back into industrial war a little bit, because if the workers are working in the factories to produce guns, does that make them part of the war effort in a way that they hadn't been before? So it's more acceptable for the Germans to send over planes and bomb factories in Britain. So those two are sort of the most obvious things. But there's also sort of things that are important as well. It's the first time that soldiers are almost all wearing camouflage uniforms rather than brightly colored uniforms, which is what they've been doing before, which changes the way that soldiers look. And there's expansions of things like canned food. There's definitely big impacts of technology. And then there's also advances in explosives and types of fertilizer as well. So the war shapes technology, and in some ways, the war spurs technology in a way that it hadn't really been done so during peacetime in the same way.
And that draws together towards what I thought we could wrap up with, which was, I suppose, some thoughts or reflections on how we talk about the First World War. I mean, we say the First World War, we talk about World War, the Great War, we've mentioned Total War. How are people talking about the war as a momentous historical event at the time? Or are they simply too wrapped up in fighting the thing to reflect on this, what we now see as an enormous turning point?
Yes. There's a reason why even quite shortly after the war starts, people are calling it the Great War. But I think at the time, you've got that famous image at the beginning of the war when all these young men are flocking in Germany and in France and in Britain to sign up to the war effort. And there's this idea that the war's going to be over by Christmas. On Christmas Day in 1914, in some places they have this truce where soldiers are playing football with each other across the lines. So that is sort of part of the story of what's happening. But I think there's also this element, and you see it in books like Eric Marie Remarques or Quiet on the Western Front. People saw themselves, in many cases, as being quite civilized. And it was this juxtaposition of industrial conflict with all of the death and destruction it was causing against this, we are very civilized, we're Europeans, we don't do bad things, we're not, violent and whatever. But it clearly showed that they were willing to do these sorts of things. And you see it, going back to what I was mentioning in Pembroke College, where you can see the memorial for the First World War. They have a memorial for the British soldiers that fell, but they also have a memorial for the German soldiers that fell in the war. And those German soldiers and officers were people who had served in the German army, but had studied at Pembroke. And you have this international traveling that is going on between different countries, and yet they're fighting against each other. Another person that comes to mind is Ludwig Wittgenstein, who was studying in Cambridge just before the war with Russell, and then goes when the war. So, I mean, it's a little bit more complicated than this, but he ends up serving in the Austrian army during the First World War. So he's at war with his fellow academics in Cambridge. And then during the Second World War, I mean, he's Jewish, so he can't serve, obviously, in the German army, but he finds himself in Britain again as a British citizen. So you do have this sort of international nature as well, that people are fighting against people that they actually know on the other side, because it's not like it was in Napoleonic Wars where people couldn't travel as much as they did, as they do nowadays, or as they did in the First World War. So at the time, it sort of, I think that's quite an important aspect of the conflict in how it's perceived, that we are these international, we are the Europeans, we know what's going on, we've got our empires, and we have our empires because we're more civilized than everybody else, all of that sort of European way of thinking at the beginning of the 20th century. And yet they fight a war which is just awful and destructive, and they bring troops from their empires to fight in the war, and they get them blown up. So it really does have this very jarring and scarring effect on the countries that participate. And maybe that even goes back to the lions led by donkeys narrative, that people after the war are saying, well, how on earth did we end up in this situation? Oh, it must be the general's fault. They wanted to kill everybody and have a big fight because it made them famous. And then the general say, oh, it must be the politicians' fault. They're all a bunch of dunderheads that don't really know what's going on, and they've led us into this horrible conflict. And then, but and also in terms of sort of looking a little bit further in history, the First World War very much sets the scene for the Second World War. There's a quote from Foch, who the French general during the First World War, who says, this is not a peace treaty at Versailles, this is an armistice for 20 years. And he's pretty much bang on. It's 21 years later that the Second World War breaks out, and the Second World War can't really break out without the First World War having the impacts that it does. So,
thank you. Well, I think we could have gone on and on and on there, and there are many things that we've introduced that we'll certainly pick up again in due course, I'm sure. I think there's much more we can say about the British side, but you've hinted already at things I think we should come back to around, the French and German perspective, and the American too. But you've given us a fantastic overview of the breadth and depth of the First World War, and we're very grateful. So thank you for your time, Saul, and for those who submitted questions, and to all of you for listening.